Chapter 61. What do you fight for? With how inexplicable the situation had become, Northern stared indifferently at the new creature with an eerie calmness. His stance was slightly bent, extending the mortal blade in the pursuit of blood and flesh, to render the terror, or rather terrors that stood before him asunder. One of them had been enough trouble already. Well, it was unsure if he remembered how much of a difficulty facing Night Terror posed. Although, despite the fact that his consciousness was lost to the cold darkness of oblivion, his instincts still inflicted a memory of fear from that encounter. Maybe he was tentatively looking at them right now because of the unspoken, ignored memories of fear that coursed not through his head, but his muscles. The two terrors stood apart from him, one holding a wicked, corrupted pole steel with a sharp needle-like tip that was almost kissing the ground. The other's eyes gleamed with an equal level of maliciousness. It had the strong flame of pure evil burning beyond the red haze that could be seen in its eyes. Northern's ragged breath soon became the only thing he could hear as an uncomfortable silence overwhelmed everything at that moment, drenching the whole room with a tense atmosphere of imminent danger caused by the terrific creatures before him. The one with the spear that was poised to attack suddenly lunged at Northern with it. Sidestepping the attack, Northern used the edge of his tenebrous blade to control the direction of the spear, causing sparks to flow as it slid past his side. Creating a 2 seconds opening, he sent his fist flying into the monster's midsection, punching as hard as he could. A blast of wind exploded from the monster's back, making the room tremble slightly. The other terror, who had also been poised to attack, flew through the air with its onyx claws curved to cleave Northern's throat. But he immediately reacted with his blade, sucking in a quick breath as shock from the parried strike reverberated through his hands, making them stiff for a second. He jumped back, as both monsters regrouped and glared viciously at him. He looked at the hand he had used to punch the monster a moment ago, and his face could tell that even he had not expected such explosive power from himself. But there was no time to become caught up in the good feeling that his newfound strength gave him. He was faced with two powerful monsters with absolutely no way forward and limited space. Northern glanced around the room, then his gaze landed on the window. There seemed to be only one solution. Even if his consciousness was lost, his intuition, honed from his character and personality before this world, took over his senses completely. Maybe that was a good thing. Maybe it was not. But right now, the only solution that Northern seemed to be thinking about shone in his eyes. Both terrors lunged at him again, a spear twirling around before it directed its sharp blade towards his head. Northern tilted his head sideways. Eyes widened in shock as the passing edge of the spear drew a small line on his cheek as it narrowly flew past him. Without wasting even a second, the claw of the other monster rushed in. But his sword came in the way, letting out a deafening metallic screech as it deflected the crude talons. Immediately, Northern had to turn and twist the blade again to deflect another strike from above. Then he had to parry another claw which was a hair's breadth close to piercing his belly. The monster's attacks were coordinated and fast, but what was more frightening was Northern's movements. He moved with a vicious grace, seamlessly transitioning between and defending against the relentless assaults of both terrors. He twisted and pivoted around, the mortal blade becoming a blur of black steel as it deflected wicked claws and a dangerous needle-sharp polearm. Each deflection reverberated in his arms with bone-jarring force, but Northern did not lag behind. As difficult as it was for him to force an attack, so was it for them to find an opening. But he was playing a losing game. With each deflected blow, the weight in Northern's arms grew heavier, his movements sluggish. And the feral creatures noticed, pressing their assault with increased ferocity, as claws and spears rained down in a relentless flurry. Teeth gritted, Northern absorbed the force of a strike with both hands clenched on his blade's hilt. In that split second, the other terror's talons moved across his vision in a blur, slashing upwards in a crimson torrent. Northern staggered back, face drained of color. Before he could recover, the spear's shaft smashed into his head. His world tilted, and deafening rings filled his ears as the force of the attack sent his head whipping to the side. His body faltered, as he slumped to one knee. The monsters paused, feral eyes burning. The spear wielder became blurred as he went into a vicious spin, then hurled its blade at the dazed Northern. Northern rolled away desperately, aiming for the window. In one fluid motion, he leaped, only for searing agony to erupt as the spear pierced through his shoulder, halting his escape midair. Eyes widening in shock, Northern stared down at the bloody tip protruding from his flesh. The terror yanked him back viciously, dropping his body to the floor in a crumpled heap. Crimson blood seeped across the stone floor as Northern struggled to breathe through the white-hot pain. Dark spots danced at the edges of his vision, his almost lost consciousness threatening to abandon him completely. North! Perhaps it was because of the semi-conscious state he was in. But he could hear a silky voice. Strangely, it felt familiar, but it was too distant to make a significant difference. And who the hell was North? With a strained expression, he shifted his gaze up, only to find both vicious terrors standing above him, their eyes burning with evil and maliciousness. It was like they were waiting for him to die. No, that was not the case. If they had wanted him to die, they would have struck to kill. But one of the reasons why their attacks could be defended to such a degree was because they seemed to have been aiming to injure him but not kill him. He clenched his teeth, trying to resist the stubborn tendrils of darkness that were forcing him to shut his eyes. Everything he had fought for, this couldn't be the end of it. He really tried to stay awake. But the amount of blood he was losing was beginning to make him dizzy. It got harder for Northern to hold on to his consciousness. He simply lay on the ground, his hand posed to push his body up but not ever trying. His vision glued to the hideous feet of the terrors. Slowly, his consciousness dimmed, and before long, Northern gave in to the beckoning darkness. Chapter 62. A Song of Metal. Fizziness didn't begin to describe what he was feeling. Northern's eyes blurred as he forced them open. There was a burning sensation in his left shoulder. He held it tightly as he let out a low groan while trying to sit up. Northern lowered his head for a few seconds. The fog swirling around his head was as thick as ever, and it was reflected by the listless look in his eyes. Then he raised his head to take in his surroundings. The new surroundings were shrouded in darkness, underlit by glowing crimson objects. His back was laid against a rocky edge, and the cold wind sneakily bit into his face. Most of his body was covered by eternal twilight, so he didn't feel it as much. He tried to stand up, but a sharp pain pierced through his left hand. With his shoulder impaled, his hand felt stiff and pale like a bloodless vessel. The white tunic of his valiant armor was dark with blood. Not being able to stand up, Northern leaned back against the wall of rough stones. The only thing he could hear were the ragged breaths from his own breathing. He stared blankly into the darkness for a while, and wondered where the crimson glow was coming from. It filled a part of the enclosure far away from where he sat. The lower parts of the ground were also crawling with the same eerie light, and there was something sickening about it. Northern licked his dry lips and swallowed his saliva to wet his throat. Even now, no thoughts formed in his head. Nothing seemed to bother him. He just lay there like a human with a dead soul. Before long, his eyes closed again to the cold embrace of slumber. Clang, clang. Northern was once again woken up, but this time it was by a metallic sound. It also had a consistent rhythm. It was like someone was either hitting a metallic surface or hitting a surface with a metallic object. Each hit was strong enough to softly resonate through the dark enclosure. And it was especially disturbing for Northern because, from the moment he was woken by the clanging of steel, he had been unable to take his mind off it. In this lonesome darkness, it served as the only company he had. His mind found solace in following every intermittent strike of the metal, and he was able to stay awake for much longer. However, that did not seem to change his situation or save him from the darkness that enslaved his soul. However, it does seem soothing and peaceful. After a few hundred clangor, it began to get unpleasant. Just when Northern thought about it, heavy footsteps approached. At this point, resisting was useless. The only thing that seemed to be awaiting him was death. With a non-functional hand, no weapons, he sighed as the footsteps stopped in front of him. With no effort, a four-eyed monster placed him over its shoulders and walked away into the depths of the crimson light. Northern watched the pale darkness where he had previously laid go farther away from him until it soon became pitch black. But at that point, they had entered a chamber with an ethereal red glow. The chamber was filled with transparent cocoons, and at the base of every cocoon were glistening red crystals ground to minuscule forms. Northern, with drooping eyes, observed that each cocoon was of the same monster. At least they had the same form. At the far end of the chamber, the monster stopped and placed him on a platform. The platform was rectangular and smeared with dried blood. There were 4 shackles cemented into it. As the monster placed him down, it pressed down on his chest with one hand, while locking a shackle on his wrist. Northern's complexion began to pale further, as he watched the monster chain his other limbs. After it was done, it walked away, leaving Northern in the disturbing clangor of steel, which was now louder than before, and more disturbing. As each clang rang, flashes occurred to Northern. It was like the metallic sound was bogging down the foggy effect on his mind. A harrowing memory was being dug out with each clang, and it was very unpleasant. Northern tried not to think. He closed his eyes, but it was hard not to. He didn't even need to. With the passing second, the whole place resonated with the racket of steel hitting steel. The racket made images flash across his mind. Those images brought a sharp pain to his chest and made his heart beat heavily. Suddenly, he felt like he was in a place he hated. However, as far as his memory served him, he had never been in this chamber before. He had no painful experience related to it that would cause so much fear, pain, and anger in his heart. These feelings rising inside of him for unknown reasons were torturous, but not as much as the sound that entered his ears or the images that flashed across his mind. And with time, it only got worse. He desperately did not want to see those images again, because they only brought unexplainable pain and torture to his heart. They began to get clearer, but with that clarity came an even more harrowing pain. Over and over again, and it was tormenting his soul. With time, he could make out a few things from the images he saw. A bare-chested boy with white hair, holding an axe and painstakingly hitting a hill of red crystals. Every swing of the boy's axe synchronized with the metallic sound that resonated around the room, and only became more torturous. As it became worse, Northern tried to move, but his hands were chained. His mouth dried, and his stomach grumbled. There was barely any saliva left to wet his lips and throat, and he just had to keep enduring the excruciating pain as his memories desperately tried to tear themselves away from the darkness enslaving his soul. After a long time, another monster came, but this time holding a crystal. It loomed over him with a vicious look in its 4 eyes and, with a distorted grin, stabbed the crystal into his wound. Northern let out a guttural cry as a sharp pain shot throughout his body, making it spasm, and his mouth foam. The beast watched with glee and left after his body had calmed down and he had stopped moving. Overwhelmed by the pain from every muscle and nerve in his body, Northern stared into the dark ceiling in absolute silence. The metallic racket was still resonating in the background. However, his eyes were wide and trembling. Crap! Chapter 63, Pain, An Unexpected Liberator. The most traumatizing experience for Northern was the days he spent in the prison mine. A spineless teenager, captured by a monster and thrown into a prison where he was forced to mine red crystals continuously night after night. The only time he got to rest was when the monster guarding him went to pack up the heaps of mined crystal shards. His food tastes terrible. He had almost died, and he had promised himself that he'd kill these 2 monsters that caused his life to become a living hell. Then, one night, under a sky as gray as any other night, he was marched to the battlefield, not given any choice but to serve as a meat shield for the monsters of the red mine, earning them barely a minute to fight. As his body shivered from the pain caused by the red crystals, Northern felt the fog shrouding his mind being barreled through. Overwhelmed by so much pain, his mind was torn apart, making it easy for the desperate memories to resurface. The feeling of nostalgia completely overtook him as the sound of clanging metal continued, and in came a torrent of memories rushing into his head. He survived. Somehow he had survived until now. However, Northern couldn't tell if he was to be proud of himself, or to even call this a survival. His widened eyes creased into a frown. For how long had he been lost inside himself? Northern tried to stand, but his movement was restricted by the shackles. He peered through in the darkness. TSK. Disgusting. Being shackled was an all-too-familiar feeling, one that was not exactly pleasing. And here he was again. Northern warded the thought away from his head and tried to calm down. After breathing in and out for a couple of seconds, he summoned his clone. A pale figure in dirty armor appeared next to him. Despite how ragged he looked, Northern's perfect copy still radiated a fearsome chill. The clone materialized a silver sword and stepped back with two of its hands on the hilt. The silver sword cut through the air and destroyed the chain binding one of Northern's hands, momentarily shrouding the chamber in a resonance of steel. Quickly, 3 other attempts followed, as Northern expected the monster that had stabbed him with a crystal to appear at any moment. He rolled away from the platform, falling to the ground, resting at the base of the concrete wall enclosing the opposite end of the chamber. He pulled out the crystal, groaning, then smashed it on the ground, shattering it into splinters. His clone stood in front of him, facing the entrance while he picked a few shards of crystal and swallowed it. Just as he did, footsteps began to approach. Northern's clone blurred forward, blending into the darkness that loomed in between the cocoons. As the monster walked past, the clone appeared from behind. With a clean sweep, the silver sword flashed in the night, and the head of the monster rolled onto the floor. You have killed a calamity beast, Shoremonger. You have gained an item. You have slain a calamity beast, Shoremonger. You have gained +6 talents fragments. Northern felt a slight surge of strength course through him. Now it was more palpable. Why? He wondered and decided to see what he had been missing. The last thing he could vividly remember was how tired he was. His Death Angel's demise. I looked forward to ending him with my own hands, but it didn't feel right doing it. The monster had died a hero. He couldn't even hate it anymore. Since then, he remembered giving himself into ceaseless mock battles with the monsters. And he remembered always going to war. But what happened during the war and after became a blur. He couldn't come up with a clear image of them in his head. My profile, he muttered. Access granted. Profile. Name, Northern Longguard. True name. Not yet received. Attributes. Formless. Soul rank. Walker. Talent fragments. 911/1000. Owned talents. 1-to-1. Owned items. Mortal Blade. Eternal Twilight. Silver Sword. Death Glare. And 23 others. His mouth dropped open. Crap. I received so many items. He unknowingly blurted out and immediately held his mouth afterward. He looked around to be sure that there was no one after him and looked down again. Sparks of surprise were still dancing in his eyes. He dismissed the panel, but his brows became creased. What bothered him the most was, everything was going on fine. If I was winning wars for them, why did they capture me? Northern inquired internally. He turned around to look at the cocoons of monsters that filled the room, spreading out to the left and right, growing above the ethereal glows of red crystals. Then something occurred to him. I've seen this before. That's right. This was not his first time seeing this place. Previously, he had sent his clone to inspect where the red crystals were going. And this was where it had traced it to, and that was where he had also discovered that they were creating several other night terrors. If my memory serves me right, those were the same bastards that attacked me. One of them joined him during the war. Maybe he didn't think about it quite deeply, but now that he did, Northern was sure. That thing is not the night terror I know. And the other 2 that attacked me too. They seemed equally powerful, but they were not it. He sighed. This is so confusing, I don't even know what is what anymore. What is the kingdom of Red Mine? What is going on in this place? Is there a reason for the war, or are all these monsters consumed by a mad hunger for blood? Northern probably knew the answer to the last question. After all, he had been there. to be consumed by insanity such that one lost their soul. If such an effect were to weigh on a monster, wouldn't it result in a more drastic effect than it had on him? Then that would explain why all the monsters in this rift continually fought each other. But another question arose at that moment. Northern had a basic understanding of rifts and what to expect of them. A rift per appearance was a manifestation of a particular dimension, which meant that all the monsters that a person encountered in a rift were related to that dimension. From their physical appearance to habits to their mechanisms and their goals. But here, there were not just 2 but 4 distinct kinds of monsters, always battling for dominion. Wasn't it weird that even when the monsters from the kingdom of Redmine claimed victory every time, they never made an effort to besiege the enemy, and the enemy had never reached as far as their kingdom's gates to lay it to waste, not even an ambush. It was just the same thing over and over again. The horn would blow, they would go to war, they would win, they would come back, and they would celebrate. Over and over again. In a never-ending loop, or so it seemed. Sooner or later Northern's mind was bound to be consumed by the madness that attached itself to the unreasonable quest for blood. Pain was the only liberator that could have set him free from those arduous shackles of darkness. Chapter 64. Ultimate Soldiers. More like ultimate lab rats. Faced with so many questions, there was very little he could do. One thing, however, that settled in his mind early enough was that he couldn't continue to stay in this place. Or the kingdom of Redmine. Northern instructed his clone to search the surrounding area and search for paths that would lead to a successful escape. He watched silently as the other him raced to the entrance, disappearing for the next few minutes. In the absence of his clone and during the expectancy of its report, Northern wondered for a second about the amount of fragments he had received. Just how many did he kill for him to be so close to 1,000 fragments? He sighed. I don't know if I should be happy or disappointed with myself, having his mind bogged down, managing to survive through it. One was worthy of praise. But the other, Northern couldn't even find the words to express how disappointed he was at himself. If there was anything he prided himself on, it was his strong mental fortitude. But it had only been his first rift, and he was overtaken by the madness of the war bred by the crazy rift. Northern had always known that rifts were dangerous and unpredictable, but witnessing it himself hit differently. The reality was tremendously scary. He shook his head and exhaled his disappointment away one last time. This time, he had learned not to overestimate himself. I'll be more careful next time. Crap. Fool, what do you mean next time? Gru. Northern paused, blinking as he heard a weak but every growl in the darkness. What was that just now? The growling came again, a bit tired and strained. Now it registered in Northern's head clearer than before. He swung his head back and traced where the growling came from. Luckily, the growling came forward again, making it easier to trace it through the darkness. Northern found himself back at the platform he had broken free from. Then a few steps to the side there was another platform. And on that platform, there was another monster. Northern couldn't see completely through the darkness, but those eyes he would recognize anywhere. Even though now, they burned weakly, almost with no life. Night Terror. His eyes widened as he stared at the figure chained to the platform, in a horrible state. Red crystals protruded from his skin, spreading disgusting red veins throughout his body. The platform was bathed in its blood, and a stream of channels connected a pathway from the platform to the base of several cocoons, where the red crystal was cemented along with the stones that held the foundation of the slightly transparent cocoons. A frown creased Northern's brows as he observed the pathway which he never noticed until now. Lost in focus, he followed each path. Walking in between cocoons, he saw that the blood was not flowing through the pathways, but the dried and black-red stain proved that it had once flowed, maybe a long while ago. And then, Northern raised his head to the cocoons standing before him. A few of them had been torn down, but this one still held a figure inside. And it had a striking resemblance to Night Terror, the two that attacked him and the one that was brought back to the battlefield. Because of his odd bond of vengeance with the monster, he was able to tell that it wasn't the one he knew. But his unstable mental state had gotten the better of him. Northern brought his mind back to his present situation. His kidnapping. A suspicion sank into his mind, and he shook his head with wide eyes. It can't be. That would just be very crazy, right? Even though he didn't want to accept it, he didn't see any better answer to the situation. It wouldn't be an overstatement to say that Night Terror was the ultimate soldier of the Kingdom of Red Mine, and the reason why so many battles were won. However, he got wounded and disappeared, and a few moments after that, a mass of Night Terrors was created. During the disappearance of Night Terror, he rose to become a formidable general, leading the monsters to the heart of victory with every battle and becoming another ultimate battle warrior. But he never got wounded, he wasn't even weakened. Maybe in a way he proved himself to be an even greater ultimate soldier than Night Terror was. Then he was brought here and tied to a platform so they could carry out the same plan. Just like the few crystals pierced into Night Terror, one was stabbed into him too. However, because of that pain, his mind was liberated, he regained his sense of self, and he was able to break free thanks to his clone. But there was no way for Night Terror to escape. Northern's face paled, the crease on his brows burrowing deeper, drawing lines of terror on his facial features. So, if I had not escaped, would I have been subjected to an experiment to multiply me? Monsters would have played around with his body. It was a terrifying idea, but at the same time, it was also the craziest thing he ever thought could happen to him. His lips opened to let out a terrified laughter, but no sound came out. As funny as this was, it was tremendously frightening. Chills ran down his spine at the thought of it. What if he didn't have the cloning ability or wasn't strong enough to break through the chains? Night Terror's weak growl rolled across the darkness, retrieving Northern's attention from his thoughts. It was obvious that the dying monster was seeking help. Hurrying towards the monster, Northern raised his hand. A black blade materialized within it, and he brought it down. The shackles binding Night Terror shattered. After breaking all 4 shackles, Northern helped the monster up. I hope I don't end up having a soft spot for monsters after this. It was very infuriating that the vile creatures he wanted nothing more than to slaughter himself and enjoy the act while doing so were being left at his mercy. He questioned if he was doing the right thing. But at the same time, Northern knew what he was doing. There was a question at the root of all these strange events. Northern's eyes gleamed coldly for a second as he thought about it. At the same time, tendrils of fear tingled across his skin. Who was behind this operation? Who could have commanded that Night Terror should be taken? Who would have dared to order for him to be kidnapped too? There was only one answer. He knew it was an unavoidable fate, but the thought of it made him wish there was another alternative. He bit down on his lips painfully. How in the world was he supposed to fight a monster that even this Night Terror couldn't face? Chapter 65. I'm free. Northern took a shard of the crystal he had broken from before and offered it to the Night Terror. The proud Hellion sneered at him. Although weak, it still had its guard up around Northern.
I'm disappointed.
I thought we became comrades the last time we fought together. Northern contorted his face into a look of pain. Night Terror let out a grunt and with its claws, picked the little shard from Northern's palm. Then Northern pointed his hand into his mouth. It's supposed to go in there. The monster looked at him for a second. Dried scars of brutal torture ran across his skin. The fierce and powerful flames in its eyes had now become faint. Although Northern had removed all the shards, the disgusting veins still ran across its body and were pulsating. I hope taking the crystal does help. So far, so good. It had worked for him, so this was the best first aid idea he could come up with. After taking it for himself, the pain, both in his legs and shoulder where he was stabbed, subsided and made his movements a little bit easier. And as he expected, minutes after using it, Night Terror was able to stand on its own, even with the amount of injuries that scarred its intimidating form. Although Night Terror still stood powerful, it looked more pitiful than intimidating. To Northern, at least. Northern's clone arrived back at the chamber and stood before the two of them. It happened so suddenly while Northern was still preoccupied with his thoughts about Night Terror. If not, he would have immediately dismissed the clone when it was outside. Now, a blanket of suspense fell on the atmosphere, It was too late to do anything. Night Terror turned and gave him a low, thick growl, the sparks of horror in its eyes almost reviving themselves. What? Don't forget who saved you. Forget the past and let's focus on the future. Okay? Right now, we have to escape from this damn place, and my clone just found out there's no secret tunnel or safe escape. Even after speaking, Night Terror's eyes stayed on Northern for a few seconds. The two stared at each other in absolute silence. Then Northern sighed and face-palmed himself. What am I even doing talking to a monster? Night Terror groaned and walked forward. It paused a few steps later and looked at the blinking Northern. Then let out another growl, gesturing its head for Northern to follow. Dazed, Northern picked his feet and followed closely behind the monster. Of course, if anyone would know a safe escape route, it had to be the strongest monster in this place. Well, second strongest, or was it third, fourth, or 10th strongest? Since several Night Terrors now existed. Northern swallowed his spit and silently walked behind the powerful back of the monster. Night Terror led without looking back, and Northern found that surprising. He and this monster in question had once been enemies. In fact, he still burned with a semblance of vengeance towards it. And yet it was showing its back to him like this. Is he not scared of dying? Or does it trust me now? Northern directed a mocking chuckle at himself. It was wild and endearing to think an ultimate soldier such as Night Terror would trust him. Or maybe he was getting emotionally attached. I should check myself. If I am like this towards monsters, what will happen when I get out of this hell and start socializing with humans? The thought of going out of the rift. Northern had chosen not to entertain such thoughts since coming to this place. Even though he would do anything to survive, he kind of didn't want to jinx it by filling his head with thoughts of what would happen next, or where the others were, and where exactly had they all been teleported to. He was just going to tackle things one at a time. For now, surviving this hell took priority. Survival mode on. Northern mused with a little shameful smile as he followed behind the Night Terror. His eyes climbed up the massive back of the monster. Still, it sure is one hell of a monstrosity. Now, he didn't feel so bad that he was beaten hands down by Night Terror, although he would repay it at all means, even if that was the last thing he did before he died. They walked through a cave tunnel with endlessly curling dark paths without taking a rest. At some point, Northern wondered if Night Terror knew where it was going or was just walking aimlessly without a purpose. He began doubting if Night Terror actually communicated with him the other time, or if he had been the one that had imagined it. Or maybe the poor monster was simply lost, and had lost them both. Within the whirlpool of those thoughts, Northern followed without a single complaint. And in due time, a dot of gray light appeared before their eyes, widening with each step they took. Northern even felt like running towards it, but that would mean overtaking the Night Terror. He admired the monster for its brave decision to walk in front, but he would never turn his back to a monster that had killed him once? No, that was impossible. The excitement of seeing a light at the end of the tunnel could hold on a few minutes more. He wouldn't jeopardize his life and foolishly attempt to trust a monster. As Northern and Night Terror came out of the tunnel, a gray sky overlaying, a seemingly endless expanse of brown lush sprawled out before their eyes. Where is this place again? Northern wondered. The rift was so large that he was beginning to wonder whether it was really a rift. Was it really possible for a rift to be as large as the current one he was in? Northern couldn't even begin to count the amount of places that he had been to. Yet the kingdom of Redmine was the only settlement of monsters that stood within the vast and hellish realm. It was hard to believe. Northern spread his arms into the air, feeling the soft brush of the wind against his skin. Immediately, he wrinkled his nose and stepped back. The wind came with a rancid odor that disgusted his stomach. He exhaled a second later and looked around, safe the disgusting smell of the air. He managed to make it out. A cold smile fell on his face as he whispered to himself. Finally, for the first time in a while, I'm free. Chapter 66. Monsters Feel Rage Too. Northern stood in the embrace of the wide, brown expanse. Everything felt right for once. Oh well, except for the smell. He'd occasionally pinch his nostrils, but there was no helping it. What the hell could be smelling so pungent? Or is it just the wind? He wondered. One could not really tell with this place. The rift was an anomaly itself. It also had a lot of anomalies in different packages, and this could just be one of them. Northern turned his head, shifting his gaze from the endless expanse to the incarnate of war that was standing a stone's throw away from him. Night Terror stood motionlessly, staring forward. But Northern couldn't tell what it was the monster was looking at. It's not thinking, is it? Northern raised a brow. Impossible. He dismissed the thought and decided to get closer to the monster. As he did, Night Terror's terrifying eyes drifted open with an intense red shine that made Northern's blood curl. He jumped back instinctively, hands posed to summon a weapon. He did, in fact, summon it as a few seconds later the mortal blade appeared in his hands. But by then, the fearsome flame in the Terror's eyes had calmed down. Northern released the sword and sent it back into his soul. The blade shattered into sparks as it obeyed the unspoken command. Then Northern cast a long gaze on Night Terror before looking away. He must be very angry about being betrayed, Northern murmured to himself. Experiencing these things was almost creating a soft spot in him for monsters. It caused him to grit his teeth thinking just about it. I want to kill the damn monster. Damn it. Including Night Terror, the Castle Lord, and all those monsters consumed by madness and every other monster that threatened his space and safety. He wanted all of them dead, and didn't want to feel bad about it. So Northern was forced to steel himself even harder and look away from the situation. Let's think the best of this. Northern inhaled and exhaled, breathing out his compassion towards monsters and breathing in logical thinking with a little bit of toxicity. I need Night Terror to fight the Lord of the Castle. I'm sure by now he wants to kill it as much as I do. Then I can just propose a temporary alliance till the Lord of the Castle who tried to kill us both is dead. That sounded like a sensible deal, if it was being made to a human. But a monster? Really, North, you can do better. How do monsters even work? Would it be possible? He was sure that Night Terror was angry, but towards whom? So far, so good. Even with all the facts laid down, all Northern had were merely speculations. Riding on those speculations felt very risky. It could have made a lot of sense if he was dealing with humans or a weaker monster. But this was Night Terror. I have gotten stronger. I can feel it in my bones, in my whole body. I can tell the difference. Northern's eyes slowly shifted towards Night Terror as his thoughts continued. And it has gotten a little weaker, but I still don't feel like I'd beat him if I challenge him. Or is it a low confidence issue? Night Terror had, after all, overwhelmed him times without number, as a predator and even as an ally. He had unknowingly developed a few shards of respect for the malevolent evil. Night Terror is a powerful monster. But he's not invincible. Northern's eyes shone with determination. I just have to be very careful and crafty with this. It's a monster. It can't be wiser than I am. It was a risk, and Northern was not going to back down from it because of his fears. Inasmuch as his mantra was survival through it all, that did not mean settling for the norm. For a walker like him, untrained, uninformed, and untalented, closing a rift was a futile struggle. And that was if this was even a rift to begin with. Hopefully, he wasn't being wrong about it all. But the addition of Night Terror in his plans increased the possibility of this happening. Northern looked down at his hands as he folded them into a fist and clenched them hard. Let's do this, he whispered to himself. Northern, after a couple of seconds of watching from behind, approached Night Terror. The Terror slowly turned its head, glancing at him and turning away to continue its seemingly aimless stare. Northern scrunched up his eyes, looking at the direction Night Terror's eyes were glued to, saying, "What are you even looking at anyway?" Night Terror was unresponsive, standing like a cutout from an ancient coal statue. Northern stood still, suspended in the awkwardness brought about by his own stupidity. I guess I really am imagining it's a monster. Let's not think too deeply about things. As if wanting to prove him wrong, Night Terror averted its forlorn gaze and looked at Northern for a couple of seconds, for eyes blinking briefly. Northern could feel an intangible weight fall on him without even having to look into its eyes. Hesitating for a second before turning his head, Northern frowned and asked with a little arrogance in his tone, "What?" Night Terror's eyes stayed on him. Beginning to become uncomfortable, Northern's frown became deeper. He stared deep into the eyes of the Terror. "I'm not going to lose in a staring contest, you know," he growled. The Terror's gaze did not waver, and indifference tore deep into his soul. Northern also returned the gesture, but with fierce, unyielding blue eyes. Then the monster averted its gaze. "Ha! I won!" Northern celebrated, but he seemed to be the only one that cared. Night Terror stared at the tunnel they had just come from, then looked back at Northern, before placing its crude talons on his shoulder and looking at the cave, its eyes burning with something between madness and anger. Northern studied the monster for a moment, then looked at the cave. Then he furrowed his brows and looked back at Night Terror's face. Seeing the fearsome look on the monster's face made his lips curl up. "Don't tell me. This bastard too." Chapter 67. An Odd Cohort. Jaw dropped, Northern stared at the Terror. It was evident what it was going through. A shaky smile appeared on his face. Northern stared in disbelief as Night Terror glared at the cave, eyes burning with vicious hatred. Northern exhaled. With that, one of his fears was now over. He had been skeptical about Night Terror being able to hate the Lord of the Castle or the other monsters. But with this, Northern had his answer. As a matter of fact, Night Terror seemed to be consumed by more anger and hatred than Northern was. Northern turned to the direction of the cave and looked at Night Terror. A villainous smirk appeared on his face in the next instance. Pointing to the cave, Northern declared, "Don't worry. We will return to this place and lay it all to waste." He withdrew his hand and then looked into Night Terror's eyes. "But first you have to heal, and I have to get stronger." Night Terror stared back at Northern, his eyes vividly expressing its primal nature, yet Northern couldn't help but feel a slight spark of intelligence in the way the Terror looked at him. "It definitely understands me. Was it the rift?" But he was speaking the common language of Tra-El-Yukian. He hadn't even needed to learn the language after his reincarnation while growing up. Understanding and speaking it came naturally to him. Of course, he was still learning other languages such as Vuzman and Elmari. They were other native languages. One of them was from the Vuzman Empire, and the other was a popularly spoken tongue in the Eastern continent. Pending the time he was to leave, he wanted to have a grasp on these things. Since I was able to understand their common language easily, I suppose it was either the system or the voice of the world. Could it also be that the voice of the world is responsible for making Night Terror able to understand me? Northern shook his head. There was a flaw with that speculation. Ul did not operate in support of the rift. At least the record of things that had happened so far was proof. One could say that the voice's ultimate purpose was for Trialians to completely eradicate the existence of rifts. So it would be inaccurate to say Ul was a part of the game. That was what Northern felt anyway. But it didn't automatically make it correct. Night Terror could turn out to just be a very smart monster. Take Mr. Fluffy for example, he could understand Northern too. "Damn, I miss Mr. Fluffy." Northern sighed, diverting his thoughts for a second and hoping that the tailless wolf did well without him. He sighed and looked at Night Terror, concluding on his speculations. So, it's either Night Terror is just that intelligent or the rift itself is playing some kind of trick. Again, Northern was sure to remind himself that he could be wrong about being in a rift. He didn't even know where he had been teleported to and why. Of course, at this point, he knew Ruffsburg was playing dirty somewhere. That was why his plan was to prioritize his survival. He wanted to go back home, meet his mom, meet his dad, and meet his unborn sister. But he had a valid reason for thinking that it was a rift. First, the sunless sky. Second, he had received an attribute. Attributes could only be received inside rifts and were signals that the walker was currently going through some kind of trial. However, Northern had never heard of a trial that lasted this long, even from his parents, who were elite drifters. However, there was nothing he could have done. He was incredibly lonely and lost in this hellish realm, dreading every lightless day. Northern rubbed his face with his palm and turned to Night Terror. Shall we find a shelter to stay for a while? We need to arrange food. I left my bag back in my room. Damn it once again. The Terror stared at him for a while, the hatred in its eyes receding. Then it nodded and began walking forward. Northern's eyes widened. He had spoken to conduct a last definitive test so as to confirm his speculations. Looks like I am right. Communicating with this bastard won't be a problem. Northern smiled and hurried forward, walking side by side with the Terror through the brown grass and having to endure the rotten smell that the wind occasionally carried past them. Night Terror, on the other hand, did not seem to be bothered by it. The odd cohort trekked a few distances before reaching a deep forest. At the backdrop of the forest was a gigantic mountain. Night Terror looked up at the mountain, then lowered his face to the forest that blocked their way, glaring at it. Northern also looked at the mountain. All he had been doing was following the Terror, and he wouldn't deny the fact that the monster looked like it knew exactly where it was going. The mountain is where we are going? It was a great idea for a shelter, and Northern was amazed that such an idea had occurred to a monster. Even he hadn't had an idea of where to use as their shelter when he'd suggested that they should find one. Having Night Terror on his side did seem like a blessing. Still, I can't believe I am here, walking side by side with the monster that captured. Damn, it could have even killed me then. Fate was a very weird thing, or did it just enjoy playing around with him? Northern groaned, dismissing his thoughts as Night Terror became the object of his focus. The creature stared intently at the forest, its eyes gleaming with an ethereal crimson light. The glow in all four eyes seemed to always shine brighter when it has its guard up or is angry. Northern inwardly guessed while observing Night Terror. The creature looked at him after a couple of seconds, then gestured forward with its head, its bipedal legs moving one after the other afterward. Northern followed closely by its side as they entered the forest. At first, he couldn't tell whether anything was wrong with the place, except the rancid smell that seemed to be even stronger and more intense. Because of that, he had to clog his nose with his hand. Then, after a few minutes' walk into the forest, Northern's skin became cold, and tension rose to great heights within his heart as he could sense a chilling eeriness crawling around the forest. In the darkness beyond, behind, and beside a lot of things seemed to be staring at them. Chapter 68. Traversing the Gloomy Forest, Part 1. Where they were currently walking through was a gloomy forest, shrouded with a thick cold fog. Towering dark trees dominated the scene, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers against the dimly lit sky. The forest was enveloped in thick shadows, obscuring their path and adding to the sense of foreboding that Northern felt. Yet Night Terror strolled forward like it was no big deal, unhindered by the absolute darkness that blocked their path. In contrast to the Terror, the scrawny human that walked beside it could not see anything beyond or beside him. All he could do was stick close to his nemesis, now turned temporary associate. The dense foliage created an enclosure, as if the forest itself was a living entity, closing in on anyone who dared to venture within. There was an absence of any sign of life, intensifying the feeling of isolation and mystery. The air was heavy and the terrible smell was stronger now than ever before. Yet Night Terror moved like it was no man's business. They continued down this eerie path for a while, as Northern fearfully checked his surroundings every now and then. The pungent smell was getting stronger and it was beginning to bother him. Suddenly, Night Terror paused and Northern, who kept turning back in search of the source of the discomforting eeriness, bumped into the still monster and stumbled back a few steps. Rubbing his forehead, he raised his head and grunted, "Yo, what the hell?" However, he came to a stop as his eyes met Night Terror's back and what was, or rather were, in front of it as more of the odd creatures crawled out from the corners of the darkness. Northern instinctively raised his hand, sparks weaving out of thin air to form a black sword that appeared in his hands. The creatures that appeared before them had large bulbous bodies covered by a mottled hide that gave a rough and uneven texture. Their forms were hunched and contorted, with thin and gnarled limbs, resembling twisted roots or tentacles, with sharp points or protrusions along their lengths. They had no distinct head. Rather, a series of orifices were scattered across their misshapen body, and at the end of their long neck were a crude set of teeth that were long like bone needles. They slowly snarled at the even mightier terror that loomed above them. Hesitation could be noted in the way they moved and had not attacked yet. Night Terror looked down on them with viciously burning eyes that emanated pure hatred. Yet these creatures lurked, although fear could be seen resonating through the masses. They still resisted, however, like hungry monsters that had not eaten for decades. One could say that the only foe that could resist the intimidation of fear was the insanity of hunger. And these creatures, despite having no eyes or a head, looked like ravaged horrors that were ready to raze everything to the ground. Tension filled the atmosphere as a grave silence persisted in the heart of the forest. Northern's heart raced, a surge of adrenaline mixed with anticipation coursing through his veins. This was probably the first time he would be fighting since the madness that overtook him got washed away by pain. Northern gripped his black sword tightly, sparks of power crackling along its blade. Night Terror stood beside him, a towering presence emanating an aura of primal fear. Their eyes met, and a silent understanding passed between them. Then what happened the next moment happened in a flash. With a guttural roar, the creatures lunged forward, their gnarled limbs reaching out like striking vipers. Northern's movements were a blur, his sword slashing through the air with deadly precision. Sparks erupted with each strike, illuminating the darkness with brief flashes. Even he was shocked for a moment when he ran forward with all his speed. He didn't expect such immense speed from himself. It was no joke what he had been through during the time he spent holed up in the prison of madness. Northern continued slashing and weaving through monsters with the precision of a thread through a needle. You have killed a hazard savage, corpse eater. You have slain a hazard savage, corpse eater. You have gained +2 talent fragments. Night Terror moved with terrifying grace as well, its massive claws tearing through flesh and bone. The creatures snarled and hissed, their misshapen bodies contorted with malice. Dodging and weaving, Northern danced with the shadows. The sound of the creature's distorted snarls filled his ears, mingling with the rustling of leaves and the crackling of twigs underfoot. Their twisted forms writhed with malevolence, their mottled hide oozing an acrid stench that clawed at his nostrils. This was probably the source of the stink. And if it was so strong while they had been so far away, Northern could only imagine how plenty of these creatures were. His eyes widened. It suddenly made sense. Crap! Clearly, these monsters were scared of Night Terror. If they were 1 or 2 or even 10, they probably would have backed down, wouldn't they? Because it made no sense. Night Terror exuded such an intimidating aura of pure malice that no monster would dare to bare its fang at it. But these ones, driven mad by hunger, dared to do so. The rift could be having an effect on them like it was doing on every other monster. Even Night Terror's extreme rage towards the Castle Lord could also be as a result of this. Monsters, after all, were simply wired to fear each other if one was immensely stronger than the other. And the distance between a savage rank to a Hellion rank was a very far stone throw. Even driven mad by the rift, they would still have feared and hesitated more than they were currently doing. But if they had numbers, Northern suddenly remembered a detail about ants back on Earth. He had never come across a creature such as them, but remembering about ants served as a great analogy. If there was only 1 or 2 or maybe a cluster and one stepped on them, they would scatter around. But when their numbers were so enormous that the ground was shrouded in a veil of black, step on them and have your legs consumed by a seemingly harmless veil of darkness. It was amazing and vile how such minute creatures, even in the face of a mighty terror, could turn the tide due to their sheer number. The whole situation in this forest worked to their disadvantage. And the only hint was the strong rancid smell. Northern suddenly had no doubt. The darkness in the forest could be hiding it, but his instincts warned him strongly. The forest was probably filled with monsters like this. If that was the case, how long before they began to overwhelm them? The even crazier thing was, the moment one fell to his sword or Night Terror's blade, they got drawn into the darkness and Northern could literally hear the tearing of flesh. He observed Night Terror while thinking of the next course of action. With every swing of his sword, Northern felt the weight of his own fear build up. However, he moved with confidence, his strikes landing with amazing accuracy. The creatures fought back with a frenzied desperation, as they bared their crude teeth, but Northern's blade tore through them, rendering different fleshes in an art of gore. Night Terror's presence was a force to be reckoned with. Its eyes blazed with an otherworldly fire as it unleashed its monstrous strength upon the horde. Limbs were torn asunder, bodies crumpled beneath its relentless onslaught. The forest became a battleground of swirling shadows and bursts of power, as the clash of weapons and the roar of the creatures echoed through the trees. Northern and Night Terror fought as one, their movements synchronized in a deadly dance of survival. Time seemed to blur as the battle continued, both sides unwilling to yield. No matter how many were being slain by Northern and his associate, the horde of corpse eaters just kept coming. At this point, Northern suspected that he was right after all. Just then, an enormous corpse eater, far larger in size than the rest, suddenly plunged out of the darkness and created a deep gashing wound across Night Terror's chest. Chapter 69. Transversing the Gloomy Forest, Part 2. By the time Northern realized how much trouble they were in, it was too late. Just when he decided to close the distance between him and Night Terror, to inform the creature of the danger they had failed to see while hoping that it would understand that at times like this, running away was not a bad idea. A bigger corpse eater suddenly jumped out of the darkness, slashing downward on Night Terror's torso, but the latter had already seen it coming and was able to lurch backward a moment before. This provided it with the chance to react with an even more ferocious attack, launching its claws into the abdomen of the monster. The air seemed to split as Night Terror's monstrous arm lunged forward, easily piercing into the monster's abdomen with its sharp claws and coming out from the back. The powerful terror raised the impaled monster to the sky, bathing itself in its black blood, as four eyes gleamed with the promise of more horror to come. At that moment, the smaller corpse eaters jerked backward and began to scramble back into the darkness, running for their lives. Northern stared, frozen in surprise. Crap? I know it's powerful, but crap once again. This is so unfair. Night Terror retracted his hand from the monster's abdomen, leaving its body to lifelessly topple to the ground. He turned around with a whitish core in his hand, looked at Northern in the eye, and swallowed it. Northern raised a brow. What the hell was that for? You don't have to rub it in my face. Night Terror seemed to shrug while turning away and walking ahead. Northern looked around them, a slight frown creasing his brows. It's still not a bad idea that we should move quickly to avoid any further confrontations with these things. Considering the size of the corpse eater Night Terror had just killed, it was probable to guess that its danger level was higher than a hazard. Or maybe disaster or even calamity. That was oftentimes the explanation for a creature's differences from the others. Who knew if other monsters of higher danger levels might be around? This was why the Northern deemed it best that they should try to get out of the forest as fast as they could. So, he hurried forward while thinking of what he was going to do to hurl Night Terror into action. Upon getting towards the monster, Northern increased his speed, rushing forward as fast as he could. The result was, of course, impressive. At that moment, he seemed to shoot forward, eating up the distance between him and the walking terror. Northern, upon reaching the monster's side, grabbed its hand and then bolted forward again, dragging Night Terror with him. At least that was how it was supposed to go. However, the terror pulled back its hand, dragging Northern back and flinging him away. Northern rolled back with quite a bit of force, blame the tremendous speed he was using. He tumbled to the ground and rolled away before managing to spring back up. Night Terror watched with a priceless oops, sorry expression etched on its face. Northern silently stood up and walked forward without saying a word. Perhaps it was because of the flood of embarrassment he was currently drowning in, or he was just so angry with the monster that he was not going to care anymore. Night Terror watched the human walk past him without saying a word. Its head slowly followed Northern as his little figure walked from the back to the front and continued to go deeper into the forest. Weirdly, the stalwart monster converted its face into a sorry expression that made its hideous appearance a little bit acceptable. Northern suddenly stopped and marched back angrily. He stopped in front of Night Terror, frowning and almost bursting from rage due to the anger that almost consumed him. "I was trying to save your life just now? Did you have to do that?" Night Terror jerked its head backward as the human, in the process of shouting, spat into his face. Northern didn't seem to have noticed, but the monster was trying to avoid being bathed with his spit. "Can't you see it?" Northern shouted again. Night Terror cocked his head, cleanly dodging another spittle. "We could die in this forest. There are so many of those things. Shouldn't we be running through this place right now?" Northern asked in a panicked manner. Night Terror moved back a little, dodging the last of the human's angry spit. It moved back and rested one of its horrifying limbs on Northern's shoulder. Northern's eyes lowered towards it, and they looked back at the monster's hideous face. "What?" he grunted. Night Terror did not say a thing and just continued to pat his shoulder. This kept going on for a couple more seconds. Eventually, Northern felt irritated and flung the monster's hand away from his shoulders. Northern had thought that he would at least save Night Terror's life more than the latter had, so that he, too, would prove to the monster how strong he had gotten since that first encounter. But he couldn't help but admit that Night Terror was an overpowered monster. Their continuous journey through the forest further cemented this fact into his head. With Night Terror's refusal to run through the forest, Northern had no choice but to walk side by side with the monster, since he couldn't boast of having a great sight in the dark. You have slain a disastrous savage. Corpse Eater. You have gained +2 talent fragments." Northern was surrounded from all sides, but he was holding on well, with the mortal blade in one hand and the silver dagger in the other. He carved through several monsters with his weapons, as white and red sparks blinked in the pitch darkness at intervals. He was fast and quick to spring into action, but the pitch darkness greatly limited how much he could do. Northern could only go for the kill when they were lunging towards him. Because of those times buried in the war, Northern found out that he had developed extremely fast reflexes, and his sense of perception had greatly increased as well. It was as if he could sense murderous intent. The moment a monster lunged at him with its crude teeth ready to tear him apart, he could accurately sense it without having to see it coming, and he could even tell where the attack would be coming from. If he was too late to spring into action, his reflex was always saving him by the skin of his teeth. His heart would beat tremendously as if it was about to jump out of his chest. Every moment he barely saved himself from being killed, it made his blood curl. There was no getting used to the fear of death. Chapter 70. The need arises, but Northern pushed through. However, the times he managed to get a glimpse of how Night Terror was doing made him perceive himself to be utterly weak. The monster was barely escaping the claws and teeth of corpse eaters like he was. Night Terror was being a menace and nothing more. In fact, it seemed to be having more fun than usual. Northern gritted his teeth, feeling a rush of adrenaline course through his veins, as he felt himself becoming motivated to do better by the terrifying monster that once tried to kill him. Damn it! What am I even doing? The question bore a weight on Northern's mind, almost threatening to slow his movement as a monster closed in. But Northern twirled the silver dagger and twisted his waist, slipping past the hoisted attack of the crude critter. He buried the dagger behind its neck and, with another twist, separated its body as the onyx blade cut through the air in a torrent of black gore. You have slain a disastrous savage. Corpse Eater. You have gained +4 talent fragments. Northern watched the monster's body crumple to the ground with a condescending gaze. He averted his eyes and looked down at the ever-consistent panel. Is it me, or did the system sound more energetic than usual? Having spent so much time with both voices in his head, Northern could easily tell if there was a slight change in their tone, since it had always been the same old tone since he was teleported here. Meanwhile, Night Terror was already done and getting tired of waiting for him. The monster shook its head dejectedly. Then, with a shrug, turned around and began to venture forward on its own. You bastard! I'm only a walker, you know. Among your rank, that is just like being a fiend. Damn it, don't ignore me! Northern shouted as he walked behind. After that last horde, the corpse eaters stopped coming. Northern could feel their murderous intent. It was strong and came from almost all sides of the darkness. But now, the duo had managed to instill enough fear in them that nothing they did could make them have their flesh and bones. Still, I guess this is easier because they prefer to eat corpses instead of living beings? That would make more sense. Since this was a land infested by the madness of war, in this ecosystem, it was only right that there should be those that sat at the bottom of the food chain. These corpse eaters were monsters that fed on the matted bodies, reminiscent of battles. To put it in a way, he would say that they were the equivalent of vultures. Northern threw a fierce glance at one of them and could feel it hurriedly retreat deeper into the darkness. A smile curled up through the corner of his lips. "I am feared," he whispered internally. Then after a couple more minutes, or maybe hours, of walking, Northern and Night Terror got to the base of the mountain he had been looking at before they entered the forest. Northern's eyes narrowed. "Wait, what?" "Calm down, North. It can't be. No way this monster would be suggesting for us to climb the mountain," he scoffed. Northern looked around. The place was rocky and sloppy, but it was prim and proper, void of any critter, at least for now. He nodded and uttered, "I suppose this is to be where we will stay for a while?" Immediately, Night Terror gave him a look of absurdity, one that made its hideous face more hideous. The monster silently turned and pointed upward. Northern followed Night Terror's hand. "What? If you want us to use that upper part, there's no big deal. Since I've never seen rainfall in this place, I don't think that should be an issue," he said as he trudged forward. Night Terror's eyes creased into a frustrated frown. The monster hurried forward and stopped Northern, placing its hands on his shoulder. Then it pointed forward again. At that moment, Northern's brows furrowed into a grim frown. He looked back at Night Terror and grunted, his tone tinged with anger. "What? You want us to climb?" Night Terror removed its hand from Northern's shoulder, shrugged, and began to walk forward. Northern watched as the Terror's back stepped farther away from him. With a grit of his teeth and a powerful shout, "Ah-ah-ah-ah!" He launched himself forward, and getting to a distance, he stopped and flew into the air, directing a kick towards the monster from above. Night Terror sidestepped the attack, but luckily, Northern's balance was not off, so he managed to land on one knee. "That's terrible," Northern gnarled. He had at least thought he was going to land a single surprise attack on the monster. Maybe I shouldn't have shouted. Night Terror was an element of surprise itself, and unless he could outperform such an element, he was still eons from catching the Terror off guard. As Northern raised his head, a frown creased his brows. Towered above him, a creature stood with 4 glowing crimson eyes looking down with a strangely familiar yet condescending gaze. "This bastard! Did it really see me when I did that?" Northern ate his shame and stood up like nothing happened in order to avoid going deeper into the topic. He whistled as he moved forward without looking back. "This bastard just wants to rub it in my face how weak I am. Crap! I want to get stronger." Right now, there was no means at all that Northern could get stronger with. He had one attribute, but it was unusable since he was a walker. Attributes played a more significant role than they seemed to. They were the magnetic pull of fate that brought drifters closer to their destiny, making them stronger. To be particular, there was something that attributes could earn a drifter, which was what made it so important. Northern did not know what and did not even know anything about attributes. But since he was currently out of options to choose from, he had nothing else to look at. He could only copy one talent for now. He couldn't see the talent's attribute, which was now even evolved. He couldn't also use his own formless attribute. Not even its description, nothing about it could be seen. It just decorated his profile like a wordy ornament to fill blank pages. And it was so frustrating that it was looking like he was out of options. But then he had items. He had gained over 20 items during the time spent in Oblivion. Northern shook his head. "The most that I can do is raise my chances of survival, a better weapon, better armor, and maybe some other fun things, but I need a way that I can get stronger. Faster." He suspected that they would only be resting here till Night Terror was in peak condition again. After that, Northern was 100% sure the monster would begin its march back to the kingdom of Red Mine, to have the head of the Castle Lord. And he doubted if Night Terror alone would be able to defeat the Castle Lord. Night Terror also probably understood. Seeing that it had no issues allying with him, Northern was sure it did. They would have to cut through hundreds of monsters before finally getting to the Castle Lord. From now till the time arrived, I need to get stronger. Northern clenched his fist as they scaled up the mountain. Chapter 71. Shelter. Alas. Scaling to the higher ground of the mountain was not an easier journey than passing the gloomy forest was. On the bright side, they encountered no monsters, but Northern, on his personal opinion, theorized that fighting a horde of savage rank monsters was a much better choice than climbing up a mountain and trying to match the speed of a terror. At first, it was bearable, since the place was almost like flat land but steep. But as they began to go further, its steepness began to get disturbing. Before Northern could recount anything, he was beginning to climb with his hands. Climbing was so easy for the monster. All it just had to do was hop from one point to another, going higher and higher. Northern at first tried to emulate that method of climbing, but he quickly realized he had overestimated himself after almost losing his grip upon landing. Hence he decided to stick to this method even though it was slow. The journey was arduous, but it did not take forever. He eventually saw Night Terror climb up into an opening up in the mountain. That moment it all made sense for Northern why the monster was looking into the far distance. But at the same time, the thought of it was terrifying. Northern dejectedly shook his head the moment the thought occurred to him. Nah, no way, that can't be true, he said to himself as he continued climbing. If truly Night Terror could see that far from the field of brown lush, then it meant the monster's sight covered over 5 kilometers. Northern was sure they had walked nothing less. The pain in his legs could tell. He was already wounded heavily on his leg, but it was bearable thanks to the red crystal he consumed. It was a good choice, he mused before returning to his dreaded thoughts. If Night Terror could indeed see that far, that would mean that the monster already thought of shelter before Northern approached it. And if that was true, then Night Terror was already planning its vengeance while they passed the tunnel. With or without Northern's help, the monster would have rebelled against its master? Northern already knew how terrifying and cool Night Terror was, and this just made him even more terrifying and cooler. And Northern hated it. Is this how it is supposed to be, though? Something feels genuinely wrong with whatever is going on with the rift. Mother told me that all monsters in a rift, no matter how distinct they are, fight for a single cause, to protect the core of the rift. Of course, his mother had only told him this information because she used it to cite an example on what it means to have unified resolve. He got nothing out of the topic, though. Several other instances like this. Northern as a child would pick odd topics to make his parents unknowingly divulge 1 or 2 infos about Ultrael. Shin was the easiest to fool. And thanks to those little pieces of information, Northern could sense that something was going on. Something that should not be happening are probably happening in the rift. If that was the case, Night Terror's rebellion would be explainable. Because should the terror not be focused on protecting the most strongest monster in the rift, the Castle Lord? Or better still, serving it regardless of its crude methods to multiply ultimate soldiers into armies? Were monsters not wired to never an opinion? However, Night Terror was different. Northern shook his head. All destination in his thoughts ended with a block because no sufficient information was available. Soon, it was like his head would explode any moment, so Northern decided to let it rest. By that time he too had also reached the cave. He climbed up and rolled into the small entry, heaving. Then he turned his head to take a look at his associate. Northern frowned a little bit. The inside of the cave was absolute darkness. Night Terror was somewhere within it, sitting, maybe lying down to rest. Either ways, Northern did not feel too comfortable about going into a dark cave where a mighty monster nestled for rest. Instead, there was a little space by the entry of the cave where he could sit and even lay down if he wanted. Although it wasn't bright up there, it was better than the inky blackness of the cave. Besides, Northern was very used to the gray darkness of the night. He had never seen the day in this place. Not once. Resting his back against the wall, Northern decided to sleep outside and vigilantly. He summoned his clone and made the emotionless vessel stand guard in case any danger draws near. Then he tried to sleep. It was a futile trial. Northern could not sleep at all. He opened his eyes with very frustrated expression contorting his face. Dark circles nested beneath his eyes and his sclera reddened with stress. But the sleep was not coming. In the absence of sleep, there was not much to do. He thought about training, but Northern's body was too weak to do so. First, he needed to rest and heal. He brought out another shard of the red crystal he had brought out and swallowed it. After a while, the slight pain he was beginning to feel on his legs after walking so much distance disappeared. Northern stared blankly for a while, trying to count the clusters of gloomy gray clouds that arrayed the sky. While he was at it and failing, he suddenly remembered he had items he wanted to look at. Northern summoned his profile window. Profile. Name, Northern Longguard. True name. Not yet received. Attributes. Formless. Soul rank. Walker. Talent fragments. 978/1000. Copied talents. 1/1. Owned items. Mortal Blade. Eternal Twilight. Silver Sword. Death Glare, and 23 others. Oh! I'm closer to hitting 1,000 fragment. Damn! I can't wait to find out what happens when I eventually do. Northern mused as the runes that displayed his fragments seemed to be glistened in his eyes. He lowered his gaze to the main point of summoning his profile. Yes. He finally has the time to check out all the cool items he had received while he was lost in madness. Chapter 72. Ludicrous Fool. Name. Mortal Blade. Type Weapon. Rank. Superior. Order. 2. Description. Blinded by his greed for supreme power, the insane monarch laid waste to his entire kingdom, making of it nothing but an ocean of blood. Weapon abilities. Blood Reaver. Last Blood. Name. Eternal Twilight. Type Armor. Rank. Enchanted. Order. 1. Description. The Twilight usually donned this armor with pride. Oh, how joyful he looked when he marched to war at the dawn of the day and rode back on the helm of victory at dusk. What is left of it now is corruption and carnage. Weapon ability. Mistwalker. Northern started his introspection with the first 2 items he had ever received in this hell. The former from a lucky kill and latter from the Lord Castle. Mortal Blade had so much potential, especially when fighting humans and monsters with red blood. Since not all monsters had red blood, some hard black, some had green, some had purple. Besides, the usefulness of the blade could not even be breached into because of how unrefined his soul essence was. He was a walker, so no one could really be blamed. Walkers are supposed to be a preliminary to what it is to be a drifter, an entry stage. And Northern had been stuck in the entry stage for a while now. He looked at the Mortal Blade description one more time. Honestly, I'm having these sentient hatred for the blade. Even though it's been through a lot with me, I suddenly feel hatred towards it because it was given to me by the same bastard who tried to turn me into a breeding machine. Northern seethed, almost letting out an annoying scoff. He was staring at the runes of the Mortal Blade with so much disdain in his eyes. Then he sighed. Let it go, North. Don't be so petty. It's just a weapon. It's connected to my soul now. And that was why he could summon it regardless of where he left it. It was even possible to theorize that once he was too far from where the sword was, it would automatically dissolve from reality and reappear as shards in his soul. When summoned, those shards weave into reality, becoming whole. He could slightly feel the presence of these shards in his soul and could pinpoint the ones he was familiar with. Just like the Mortal Blade, Eternal Twilight was currently donning his body, dirtier than ever, smeared with dried bloods. Northern himself could not give any explanation which monsters they were, since he had it on throughout the period where he was enchanted by madness. He was still staring at the Mortal Blade and Eternal Twilight floating before his eyes on 2 different panels. He was about to swipe away when brought his eyes back and narrowed it. Something had caught his attention in the description of the Mortal Blade. Blinded by his greed for supreme power, the insane monarch laid waste to his entire kingdom, making of it nothing but an ocean of blood. Northern touched his ear, softly caressing it as his focus burrowed deep into the description. He was reading it over and over again in his head. Then he remembered what he had thought the first time he woke up in the prison mine. The ground was like blood had rained and dried, making it red. Then the growth of the red crystals encased by the red stones. Northern's eyes widened. Could it be? The clue that he had been searching for in order to get out of this hell was in the description of items? Northern let out an unbelievable chuckle. It had been right under his nose all this time and he couldn't see it. Seriously, I'm supposed to be a genius, but crap. He couldn't help but see himself as a ludicrous fool. The description clearly said, blinded by his greed for supreme power, the insane monarch laid waste to his entire kingdom, making of it nothing but an ocean of blood. It was not out of place to assume that the said ocean of blood was the reason why the ground of the mining prison was red. When again he thought of how vast and large the place was, it further made sense. Then the insane monarch must have been. His suspicion drifted towards only one person, the castle of the Lord. It all made sense. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together, and this could very much be accurate because items, after all, were woven from the memories embedded in the soul of monsters. Each item gained in a rift had something to do with the rift. Northern became more sure of this as he went through the description of the eternal twilight. The twilight usually donned this armor with pride. Oh, how joyful he looked when he marched to war at the dawn of the day and rode back on the helm of victory at dusk. What is left of it now is corruption and carnage. The lobe of his ear was trapped between his fingers as he gave meaning to the description before him. Since this came from a monster that was from another kingdom, the twilight could have been a name for a certain warrior. Northern's eyes widened as he realized something again. Then he corrected himself. Or a true name. Yes, it makes more sense. After all, rifts and Ul associated themselves with true names. Arg. There are so many complications. For some reason, putting Ul and the rifts together seemed wrong. Ul was supposed to be their savior, the voice of the world that granted all its inhabitant a way to deal with the mess of rifts. He proposed that in these items' description, the name Twilight was more of a true name than an ordinary one. But also there was a flaw with this thought pattern. Rifts are supposed to be other dimensions that have been swallowed. Then are the monsters rewritten based on the events that led to the fall of these dimensions? Do the existence in these swallowed dimensions then become monsters? Wait, were monsters once humans? Is that why Night Terror could understand me? So many questions raced within his mind, and there was not a single question to them. It was so frustrating. He decided to focus on the ones he could handle. I'm just going to go for Twilight being a true name and that Ul and the Rift having some sort of conspiracy. Yes, it's safe to assume the worst for now. Let's not be optimistic. Being optimistic sucks. If so, then it was safe to assume that this person called Twilight used to win wars for another kingdom that was not the kingdom of Red Mine. So the kingdom of Red Mine used to lose the battles? Chapter 73. It was almost impossible to think about. Even with a mighty warrior like Night Terror, the kingdom of Red Mine used to lose? From the description, Twilight won several battles. But that was all that was said. Nothing was spoken of a lose. It just said, what is left is now corruption and carnage. It said a lot and at the same time said too little. Northern didn't want to impose his thoughts too much on what the description could be. It could mean what befell Twilight and the kingdom he fought for, or it could simply be talking in the trails left as madness consumed them, and as opposed to the pride and joy Twilight donned this armor, what was left was now corruption and carnage. Northern found no better link for it than the madness. He had seen how insane it drove a warrior. But that was him imposing his thoughts on what the description could be. If he was to be rational, that would mean nothing. Nothing at all was spoken of a defeat in the item's description. Northern wanted to follow that notion. He just couldn't keep his thoughts from flowing into what might be. And strangely, it felt right. He decided to discard these shards of clues. Perhaps later as the nights progress, or as he checks other items, they'd progress. Well, let's look at the rest first. The excitement of wanting to find out how much he had gained was just so overwhelming that he couldn't wait anymore. Name: Silver Sword. Type: Weapon.
Rank: Superior.
Order: 1. Description: A hero rose and his light illuminated the darkness of the world. Weapon abilities: Beacon of Hope. Beacon of Hope. When the sword is raised up, silvery feathers appear and swirl softly around you. Every ally within 30 feet of you is immune to the effect of fear and intimidation. Northern raised his chin slightly. Nothing good about this. I have no plans to become a general ever again. But the description, though. I suppose there was a well-distinguished warrior that expunged darkness from the world. But that was that about it. Even that information was too little to make anything of. I guess I really can't pour my thoughts into these things. They have to make sense on their own or not much can be known. I could presume and be wrong. The best thing to do was to just follow what made sense. Just like the ocean of blood description from Mortal Blade and the red stones of the prison mine. That made a lot of sense. He went on to the next. Name: Death Glare. Type: Weapon.
Rank: Superior.
Order: 2. Description: Driven by utter madness, even the hero of light became an accursed soul, enchanted by the beauty of darkness. Weapon abilities: Death Kiss. Blood Drinker. Death Kiss. Anyone stabbed by this dagger is bound to die. Blood Drinker. When the dagger is suspended into a target for a while, it continues to drink up the target's blood. When the dagger is full, it changes skin from black to crimson. This blood can be used to heal another by stabbing the dagger into them. One of the reasons Northern was so hung up about this dagger was the Blood Drinker ability. It was a type of healing ability which he didn't have. In fact, he had considered copying a healing ability first thing when his talent slot increased. Now that I look at it, the dagger and the silver sword might be talking about the same person. Northern reasoned. The silver sword spoke about a hero. Death Glare also spoke about a hero. Does that mean this hero later fell into the darkness he was supposed to be illuminating? How laughable. Northern scoffed. Then he continued to inspect the rest of the items, oblivious to the silent passing of time. With a frightening focus and attention to every detail, Northern inspected all other 23 items. And he now divided them based on their usefulness. There were quite a number of useless items. There were average ones which could come in handy, and there were exceptional ones that wowed even him. The best of which were: Name: Earring of Forgotten Flames. Type: Charm. Rank: Normal. Order: 1. Description: My flames have been forgotten. Weapon abilities: Normal fire resistance. Name: Shadowglass. Type: Weapon. Rank: Arcane. Order: 1. Description: 1,000 shadows live in this ghostly stiletto. Weapon abilities: Shadow Restrain. Shadow Restrain. This ghostly stiletto can be used to restrain a creature through its shadows. Name: Guiders. Type: Gloves. Rank: Normal. Order: 1. Description: Worn by Exorcist. This gloves expels the dark. Weapon abilities: Untainted. Untainted. When this hand wraps are equipped, you are resistant to necrotic and mind attacks. This pretty much explained itself. Immediately Northern had seen it, he didn't think twice before adding it to the list of his exceptional items. If he had this, then he definitely wouldn't have been victimized by the madness of the rift. The last one was the one he loved the most. Name: Soul Taker. Type: Weapon. Rank: Arcane. Order: 1. Description: The souls of the fallen cries, they will stop at no point until nothing is left. Weapon abilities: Soul Taker. Soul Taker. This obsidian blade deals ignore slashing resistance and deals soul damage. There was only one reason why Northern loved this weapon the moment he saw it, only one reason he added it to the list of exceptional. I won't be using this until dire situation. His gaze shifted into the cave and drifted back. Then the list of items which were passable were also there. This were not too great of weapons and mostly consisted of utility items. For example, Northern opened his hand. Shimmering of shards appeared and merged, forming a orb of light that floated in his hand. 10 around him was immediately illuminated by light. There was another wooden flute that when played made the player sleepy. Northern at first classified it as useless, since it was a practically impossible item. If the user is bound to get sleepy while playing it and dozes off, then the tune stops and he jacks back awake. He didn't see it working at first, but then he remembered he has a clone. For times when insomnia will strike hard without pity, he classified it as useful. There was also a covered cup that no matter how much water is poured, it can never be filled. Then like 10 junks of items he just couldn't wait to get rid of from his soul. Like a feather that made one laugh irresistibly. A stone that can never hit its mark. A broken sword. Sadly, not much was in the information that hinted him towards the situation of the rift. He sighed and closed the floating panel. Now he was feeling more tired than ever before. He stood up and dragged himself forward with the floating light orb in his hand. Now that he had a source of light, sleeping with a monster in the same cave can be a little bit bearable. Chapter 74. Northern's Decision. First night passed. Would have been what to be said if day blessed this hellish realm with its appearance. Minutes were never distinct from minutes and hours seemed as far apart from each other as they seemed as close. Northern was not sure for how long he slept after entering the cave, but it was for a long time. Reason being that it was the best he had slept since his first step into this hellish realm. The days of the prison mine were his worst days. Closing his eyes was like a sin. He had little to no time to sleep well. And when he became a general, things got better, but he refused to let his guard down. That automatically affected the intensity of sleep he had. The days of madness. Nothing he could recall. Even though he was sleeping on stony ground and those days he had the luxury of bed. It was so strange how he could still enjoy his sleep now more than then. His mind felt at peace. Now more than ever. Even though it was by the side of his nemesis. Northern stretched as he woke up from his intense sleep. He looked around. The stalwart monster was nowhere to be found. He stood up, the light orb floating next to him. Then he walked out of the cave. Seated outside was the stalwart monster, to be particular, it was crouching. For once, I'm taller than this bastard, Northern thought as he stood beside Night Terror. The stalwart creature did not spare him any glance and just stared blankly into the wide expanse. Everything spread out before them more accurately, each details flawlessly displayed within their vision. The thick, dark, lonesome trees of the gloomy forest, flooded by a thick cloth of darkness that seemed to burn endlessly. The brown lush afar, the cave that they came out from. The backdrop of the entire view was filled with mountains that seemed to be fading with the horizon. Northern didn't need to look twice before recognizing what those mountains were. The prison mine. He dreaded it so much. Northern seethed and turned to Night Terror. Feeling his gaze fall on it, Night Terror finally turned to look at Northern, red eyes shimmering gently with ethereal glow. Northern started. I have something to say to you. The Terror's composure seemed to change slightly as he spoke. I want you to spar with me. It was so hard to say that Northern had to look away with a frown. Night Terror stared at him, all 4 eyes blinking. Northern, squinting his face together, grunted out. What? The Terror stayed silent for a couple more seconds and slowly rose. Then it opened its claws, grinning hideously at Northern. Bastard! Its eyes were clearly saying, I'm going to enjoy this. It was very bold of him to dare, but Northern saw no other choice apart from this. The night before this night, Northern had been worried. They have finally found a shelter and would possibly spend the next few nights recuperating from both their injuries. After which they would go back to the kingdom of red mine and rain carnage everywhere. There was absolutely no plan. Northern felt so. After all, what plan could a monster have apart from plunge into the horde and decimate them? There were the other newly created Night Terror replicas. Compared to the others, those ones were bound to cause more trouble. But he was not bothered. All he just had to do was leave the more difficult stuff for Night Terror and his clone to do. However, for the sake of his growth and to be rewarded heavily for the closing down of the rift, he needed to take part in the last fight. and it was definite that Night Terror would be needing his help. Simply because by now Northern was sure the Castle Lord is a Maelstrom rank monster and Night Terror is a Hellion rank. But with a high danger level, maybe even catastrophe, Northern suspects. Otherwise, how else would the Terror's overwhelming might be explained? For the sake of the last fight, Northern needed to do one single thing: grow. And he was offered very limited choices. Of all monsters, Night Terror, the same monster that almost killed him, would now spar with him for the purpose of his own growth. Northern shook his head unbelievably. Fate is a strange thing. How annoying. And so for the sake of that last battle he has to do what he has to do. Of course, he was not going to be mindlessly sparring Night Terror and revealing all his capabilities such that the monster would have them seared into its mind. Since both were bound to eventually face each other, Northern knew that would be the highest form of stupidity. He couldn't as much say he had a battle style yet, but Northern was willing to try out a few things. Some practical questions he had about combat could be answered during his duels with the Night Terror in the next couple of nights. And through the multiple duels they'd be having, he'd be able to work something out for himself, something that will be unique to just him. And Night Terror would be his instrument for it. There was another side to this which Northern felt was another good reason. The darkness. They'd be training in the darkness. During their fight with the Corpse Eaters when passing the gloomy forest, Northern has been made to realize how helpless he was against thick darkness. The only thing he had was his war-developed perception. It was sharp and accurate, but what if he is not able to catch up at times? The only answer he could provide for himself was to give himself to sparring in the dark. And here they were, in a dark cave, a terrific creature and a thoughtless human. It was just the perfect scenario to put these things into place. So before sleeping, Northern decided that this was what he was going to do. And he had no doubt about it that it was going to work. In fact, the thought of going through with it was exhilarating. For the next couple of days, Northern sparred endlessly with a monster. Chapter 75, Hope in Desolation. In a hauntingly desolate landscape, the remnants of a once proud civilization lay in ruins. The castle, now but a crumbling shell of its former glory, stood as a solemn testament to the passage of time and the devastating aftermath of a cataclysmic event. Its walls, once sturdy and majestic, now cracked and weathered, bearing the scars of the disaster from time past. Even though barely standing, towering turrets stretched into the embrace of the gray sky. Despite the castle's state, its architecture evoked an amazing sense of grandeur. Beneath the castle wall was a cluster of settlement, equally given to the disaster. The terrain was fractured in several areas. Some buildings were without roofs. Many more were abandoned, perhaps because of the darkness that looms there. Closer to the base of the castle wall, a people could be seen going about their activities. It was like every fantasy city, only with a significant touch of a post-apocalyptic event. The people wore ragged clothes and sold skewered monster meat. Others just sat on the floor, displaying not too attractive items for sale, with desperate expressions to sell on their faces. Tents torn and sewn together from flags could be seen nestled here and there, and some group of people actually lived there. Entering their castle wall, more tents and makeshift shelter built from woods decorated the compound. A wide staircase from the point of the castle compound led to a large door with intricate patterns that barricaded the interior of the castle. And in the castle, a bustling community thrived, defying the odds of the post-apocalyptic world. The once abandoned halls and courtyards now teemed with activity, revealing the resilience of the human spirit. Each structure bore the marks of resourcefulness and adaptation, a testament to the survivors' determination to create a sanctuary in this harsh reality. Within this improvised settlement, life pulsed with a quiet vibrancy. Children played in the shadowed corners, their laughter echoing through the corridors. Groups of people gathered, sharing meals and stories, finding solace and camaraderie in their shared struggles. Stalls and tables were set up, displaying an array of meager goods. The air was filled with the scent of cooking fires and the lively chatter of bartering, as the survivors inside the castle traded what little they had managed to salvage or scavenge, although with a better expression than those of the outer settlement. In the smaller throne room of this place, as the larger one has been used to accommodate more people. A group of people sat around a rectangular table. They were not the finest of faces, well, except some exceptional few, but each and every single one of them exuded an ambience of resilience. Overall, an air of power and cogency occupied the room. At the head of the table was a familiar brown-bearded man, wearing a white shirt, its sleeve rolled. The white couldn't as much be called white anymore. His waistcoat was now tattered and sewn in different areas, but he did not seem to care. Despite his unseeming appearance and tired face, his eyes burned with a flame of resolve that seemed to ignite everyone in the room. There were familiar faces too, such as a lady overflowing with thick twisting vermilion hair. One of her eyes was covered by an eye patch, and even in this desolate part of the world, she still held a bottle in her armpit. Opposite her was a young lady, with scarlet red eyes that seemed to pierce into anyone she looked at. Long flowing black hair cascaded down her shoulders. She was captivating despite the stern and enigmatic look on her face. The air around her commanded a presence that demanded attention without asking. There were other notable people in the room too, such as a green-haired boy, a white-haired girl with golden eyes that glowed ethereally, a dark blue-haired boy with trouble lurking in his tiny but vibrant eyeballs, a scrawny boy in glasses that kept trembling, and more. All their attentions drew towards the person standing as he started, his thick voice rolling into everyone's ears. "We have all been away for the past 4 months, gathering information about this place, the Dark Continent." He paused, looking at all of them. They were so inexperienced and childish when they came here 6 months ago, but now, they all look like dependable drifters. For a second, it was like he wanted to cry, but he shook it off and continued. "Thank you all for staying alive, but this is just the beginning. Now, I will call upon us one by one to share the things that we have all managed to put together from our expeditions." The man said. His eyes swung gently across to a young man with a well-groomed ginger hair, stood up, bowed his head and scanned everyone with calm eyes before speaking. "As you suspected, Sage Gilbert, there was another rift in the far west of Sloria. Survivors also existed there." His clenched hands trembled. "But their gates were locked to outsiders. I think they are what is left of the Sloria nation and are being sponsored by Luengard Empire." Gilbert nodded at the boy, giving him the permission to sit. Then he turned around to the lady closest to him on his right. Annette sighed and stood up, nonchalantly gulping down her throat for a couple of seconds before she talked. "Well, it's just as the little guy said, except that there was no survivors." Her eyes creased with seriousness. Her voice almost trembled as she added after a breath. "It was a Tier 4 gate." Immediately all of them in the table widened their eyes. Even the scarlet-eyed girl who had remained expressionless frowned slightly. Gilbert could not contain the shock of realizing it. Of course they had expected something of such, in fact more. But after interacting with the survivors that were barely keeping themselves together, some things were made clear, and Gilbert began to think. Maybe the situation is not as dire as we think it is. 6 months ago, a large group of students suddenly found themselves in the heart of a desolate city, headless monsters, with neck ending in sharp jagged teeth, racing towards them with vicious hunger. The students were left in the heart of danger and were forced to fight for their lives. That was the stage where some people made a distinct name and reputation for themselves. When all of them fell apart in dread and horror, a single lady suddenly stood out, endlessly fighting the monsters without saying a word. She protected as many as she could while they all cried and shook like babies. Seeing her resilience despite their stupidity began to light the flames of resolve in others. With her at the forefront, the students were eventually able to break through the horde of savage rank monsters, which wasn't hard considering that they were all drifters, and encountered a refugee settlement of some sort. Upon reaching the settlement they encountered Gilbert, Annette and a twin ladies who also got transported according to them, against their knowledge. Gilbert led an interaction with the survivors of the Dark Continent whom miraculously had been surviving for over 30 years now. The stories he heard wowed him and gave him hope. Perhaps they could save the Dark Continent and rid it of monsters. Chapter 76, Brave Hearts and Valiant Souls. It was not hard for the students to blend in, most especially when it was known that some people had been here before them. With the help of Gilbert, Annette, and the twin, the drifters were provided with basic knowledge about survival in a desolate land like this. The best were picked and a city claimed by monsters was taken back. It now served as their refugee center, shielding them from the stronger monsters that couldn't be dealt with immediately. The next thing Gilbert sought to do afterwards was gather information about what happened. Not much was known by other continents. It was just a sudden monsters started reaching the borders. The first incidents claimed lives of hundreds. This warranted the Academy to dispatch its strongest drifters. Protectors. Protectors were sent to the border to protect monsters from crossing over to the Central Plains. And that operation so far had been splendidly successful. Even though there was no idea where so much monsters were coming from and why they are able to easily cross despite it being a vast ocean. Nothing was known of when the Starlock continent fell and became a monster-infested land. Although many blamed it on the fact that they were only a small continent that should have merged with one of the continents nearest to them. But because of a mighty empire sitting within it, Starlock earned its right to become a continent. After much questioning, Gilbert was able to find out what had happened. It was not the rift that was an issue. Even though only 3 nations stood on Starlock continent, they were more than enough to stop the onslaught of a rift, challenge it and close it down before something happens. Most especially the Luingard Empire, a formidable nation that very few was known of, even that few were things known from books, such as all the imperial family having only white hair. The real problem that faced Starlock continent was the kind of rift that suddenly appeared in their realm. All of a sudden, 4 rifts appeared at their cardinals. East, north, west, south. The people were quite shocked, but since it was a rift and they still had time before its shattering, they didn't think much about it and began to prepare to venture inside. However, one night, another rift appeared in the center. This rift was different. It shattered immediately after appearance and began to vomit different kinds of monstrosities. The people were overwhelmed by the numbers and voraciousness that these critters attacked with. No matter how many kills, they just kept coming, till they had covered the continent, razing everything to the ground. Of course, except one place, Luingard Empire. Even in this chaos there stood as a formidable pillar but selfish and nonchalant towards the state of their neighboring countries. Their bothers was locked and contact was cut away from outside. The Empire had all that they needed for survival and times when more is needed. They would send out an expedition team, or sponsor survivors on the outside, help them survive by supplying them with their needs, while they hunt monsters and minerals for the Empire. It was a cruel state to be in. As time went by, the gates only became once. The 4 cardinal rift did not shatter even after its shattering date was due. Shattering differed based on rift tier. The most that it takes for a Tier I rift to shatter is 14 days, Tier 2, 21 days, Tier 3, 43 days, Tier 4, 60 days, Tier V, 69 days, Tier 6, 71 days, Tier 7, 75 days, Tier 8, 80 days, Tier 9, 90 days, Tier X, 100 days. And even though all the rift that appeared at the cardinal points were Tier 3, nothing happened after 43 days. So the 2 nations formed an alliance and ventured into the rift at the center to close it down, as it seemed to be the problem. But they never came back. What bewildered Gilbert most in this information was that all these rifts were Tier 3 rift. Perhaps Starlock continent was just really weak. We'd have taken care of Tier 3 rifts with no noise, was how he felt. However, hearing what Annette was saying, something sounded wrong and impossible. Tier 4? That's impossible. They all confirmed it to be Tier 3 for us, Gilbert retorted, his voice striking through the air with thundering ferocity. Annette dropped the bottle she was holding and folded her arms, and began to speak, her voice dancing out with steamy breath. I don't think the people were lying either. Out of 4 rifts, I personally investigated 2 with my team, and there was something about them. If indeed the natives are not lying, then there is only one suspicion coming to mind. Gilbert frowned and replied her, muttering, a deviant rift. His words were audible enough to reach the ears of the first 3 seers both on his left and right. The young lady with scarlet eyes and black hair turned her impeccably beautiful face to him and asked, "What's a deviant rift?" Her voice was adorned with a tender grace. Gilbert looked at her and sighed. Then his voice rolled out, tingling with respect towards the inquirer. He said, "A deviant rift is an abnormal rift. There are different types. Some could be ones that shatter quickly after appearing like the rift at the border of this kingdom, or ones that masquerades as a weak tear, hiding its soul energy and revealing its true tear the moment drifters enter it." He lingered before continuing. "The most dreaded ones are the types of rift that can grow." All their eyes widened in shock. Except the scarlet-eyed lady. The expression on her smooth face barely changed. "The fact that one of this rift grew means that we must quickly begin to act. I believe that, with our strength and numbers, we can close down the 4 rifts." Someone raised his hand, causing Gilbert to stop and call him out. "Yes, Eric." The scrawny boy stood up, bowing and tardily adjusting his round glasses. "I'm just being objective, really. An entire nation was not able to clear these rifts. Isn't it ignorant of us to think we can?" One of the guys seated at the table with green beautiful hair and a porcelain skin looked towards Eric with a warm smile smeared on his face. His enchanting voice rang through the room even though he spoke softly. "And what would you have us do then? Sit around till our damnation comes?" Eric bowed his head. "I'm sorry." He trembled before the beautiful male and lowered his head. Gilbert sighed and cautioned, "This is the last time I will allow Bram." The green-haired boy stood up and bowed his head towards Gilbert, smiling sincerely. "I'm sorry, sir." Then he sat down, smiling with both his eyes and lips. "Since I have listened to the last report from Raven and her team personally, I will skip that and make an announcement based on the information we have at hand." He paused and breathed. A brief silence hung in the before he continued. "We will be venturing into the gate at the northern Starlock Pole. I think it is only right to close it down before any further anomalies happen." His eyes glided around, burrowing into the eyes of all 10 team leaders before him. "We have prepared for this for 6 months. Do not be scared. We are more than ready to close those rifts and fight our way back home. When you arrived here, you guys were weak and hopeless brats. But now, I only see drifters who will soon become masters, brave hearts and valiant souls. Do not fret, you guys are strong enough to do this." With that, the meeting was dismissed and everyone went to prepare personally, to venture into a hell that one of them has been living for the past 6 months. Chapter 77. A Nemesis, Associate and Teacher. Northern's plan for training was perfect. Actually, it was madness. A different and handmade kind of madness, and it did not take him that long to realize it. Maybe Night Terror was just being an antagonist and wanted to make him suffer within those times that he had. Maybe the stalwart monster was just being very honest and fighting voraciously for Northern's sake. Or both. Either ways, it did not go easy at all. Of course, easy was not what Northern was looking for. He had thought about this very well. He was thrown into a hell. If he wanted to survive through this place, he had to do it the hardest way. Fight the guardian monster, find and destroy the core of the rift to close it down, and finally return home to the bosom of his parents. He thought about the crude things he was going to do to Ruffsburg when he got back, but Northern decided not to fuel his purpose and passion with vengeance. It only provided power and limited versatility. Northern was ready to grow in ways that no one expected, and become the best of the best. He would survive this at all cost. And to do that, he needed to continue fighting Night Terror. At first their duels breathed nothing but cuts and wounds for him. He couldn't as much block the Terror's attacks, not to say of landing a clean hit. Northern was made into a training doll. It was hard to tell if he was the one training. It just looked like Night Terror was practicing with a spineless human. That was just the beginning, though. Northern executed the spirit of a resilient warrior. His persistence was shocking even to Night Terror. His mental fortitude was tough, and when a path to an attack was destroyed totally by Night Terror's domineering strength, he didn't stop. Instead, he went harder, stubbornly choosing to experiment the same thing till it worked while accommodating flexibility. It was hard, but it was possible. In fact, when the first attack slipped through and got to Night Terror, the monster expressed shock, frozen for a few seconds. Northern had that point, felt like he had defeated Night Terror, but it only got worse. That unnatural wit of his, backed up by a resilient spirit, was matched by the most fearsome ferociousness. Night Terror only got faster. His attacks carried more power such that Northern would fly away like a rag doll. Nights after nights, Northern suffered in the hands of this terror, but he chose to continue. He wasn't expecting to achieve all of his success in combat with this one fight. No matter how brilliant he was bound to give in to the effect of time and experience. But one thing that Northern was sure about was that this fight between him and Night Terror was going to build a raw foundation for him. With it, he was going to grow exponentially without having to learn martial art or spell art of any sort. By his own self, he was going to become strong. Huff, huff. But it was easier said than done. Northern panted, resting on his knees. Blood streamed down his nose and dropped on the ground one after the other. Crap! This is hard. He raised his head and wiped the blood off his nose with the palm of his hand. Northern, after being delivered a skull-breaking headbutt, had rolled and tumbled deep into the cave and smashed himself against the dead end. It took a lot of sailing through the dizziness to finally stand, but he did it in the end, even though he was still a bit stunned. I wonder if I really am improving or I'm just getting myself beat, Northern thought to himself. But he knew better. It was slow, but there was a progress. When the fight started, he wasn't fast enough to dodge or strong enough to block. But now he was doing those too, although he had to endure a lot of pain burning through his muscles and bones. It's not enough. I have to get better. I have to do better. Northern's eyes seemed burned with blue flames, emanating determination and stubbornness. He straightened his back, stretched a little, and was about to walk away, but suddenly stopped, squinting his eyes. What is this? It was slight and almost unnoticeable, but Northern saw it. In fact, he had to squint his eyes because of it, the tiny bit of light ray that seeped into his eyes. It was very shocking that Northern turned back in hurry, eyes widening. Where is it coming from? Where is light coming from? This was a dark cave, a place that no source of light should be. The entire rift itself was void of light. An array that clear meant only one thing. There's light somewhere. There's light somewhere. That was the only thing that rang in Northern's head as he diligently searched for the source of light. He scanned every corner and then finally turned his eyes to the dead end of the cave, where he had crashed against. There it was, a slight cavity, and through it, a ray of light was desperately trying to escape but being absorbed into the eternal darkness of the cave. Northern's eyes widened even further, almost popping out. Like a starved animal that finally found food beyond a wall, he scuttled towards the dead end and began to dig. It was a cluster of large stone that seemed to have been fallen or moved to the end of the cave to either conceal the outside from something inside, or conceal something inside from the outside. Whichever one it was, Northern couldn't wait to find out. He wanted to know as soon as possible, so he began to dig through the stones with his wrist. When he saw that there was little he could do, some stones were so large and his lean hands might be able to deal a shattering strike, but not without breaking. He ran back and managed to fetch the terror, his nemesis, associate, and now teacher. A very wicked one as at that. Night Terror, after seeing Northern's desperate attempt to bring him somewhere, finally heeded and reached the dead end of the cave. Seeing several tiny rays of light that had managed to plunge through after Northern moved and broke a few stones, the monster hesitated but eventually threw a blow. It cost just one terrifying blow that shook the whole cave, shattered the stones, and sent their shards flying into different directions. An overwhelming flood of light purged the darkness, making both darkness inhabitants shield their eyes away from the light. As Northern slowly turned towards the source of light, his eyes trembled at the sight before him.
Ashash Oli Krap.
Chapter 78. A strange place. Spreading out before their eyes was a magnificent visage of an ancient settlement carved into the towering cliffs of a vast cavern behind the dark cave. Light filtered in from unseen openings above, casting a warm glow on the intricate network of dwellings, bridges, and walkways that cling to the rock faces. It was impossible to trace where the light was coming from, but it endlessly drowsed the scenery with a flawless illumination. The structures appeared weathered and eroded, their stonework blending seamlessly with the natural contours of the cave walls. Arched windows and doorways dotted the cliffside edifices, hinting at a once-thriving community that made this subterranean realm their home. Winding paths and rickety bridges interconnected the various levels, and verdant plant life clung to any available crevice, adding splashes of green amidst the earthy tones. In the cavernous depths below, a sluggish river winded its way through the settlement, its waters reflecting the warm light and casting dancing shadows on the rock walls. It was as if this hidden settlement had stood witness to the rise and fall of civilizations long forgotten. Yet, even in its crumbling state, a lingering aura of mystery and wonder permeated every crevice and archway that invited them in. Northern and Night Terror stared for a while, bug-eyed. The point of entry of the cave where they stood was like a doorway arch. Northern looked up, back, and turned his head to the settlement. Perhaps this is a tunnel that used to connect them to outside world. No doubt about it, this must have been a settlement from when this dimension thrived, before the rift swallowed it. Northern jumped and slipped down, landing on one bridge. Luckily, Night Terror landed with a heavy thud, and straightened up with an intimidating presence. Northern glared and scoffed. Show off. Without paying attention to it, the monster began to walk forward while paying attention to its surroundings. What does it even know around here anyway? Northern grunted inwardly and began walking, crossing the bridge to enter into one of the doorways. In the center of the chamber he entered, carved into the doorway, was the statue of a maiden with a large bowl on her head. When Northern stood before the strange lady, it was like she was kneeling before him. Feels strange, he speculated and moved his eyes away, scaling towards the wall of the building and squinting his eyes to focus more. He could see strange, intricate carvings adorning the walls. Northern followed through from the first imagery description carved into the wall. He retracted his head after observing it for a while and tilted with slight shock. Murals. They were murals, work of arts that seemed to depict a story of some sort, were inscribed on the wall. Northern, when he entered this place, had no doubt that this place was a settlement. But seeing this carvings, the statue, more so, the chamber had no single belongings that seemed to have been left by homestayers. There were broken and decayed table here and there, and overturned golden plates. But that was just it. However, all corners of the walls were filled with the murals, seeming to have an endless story to tell. The first image depicted a man chained with several ladies carrying bowls just like the one carved into the center of the chamber. Northern moved close to it, leaning his head very close to inspect it. There was a single man amidst two rows of maidens with the same bowl upon their heads, walking in their middle. Then the next mural still depicted them walking. Northern followed the murals till he got to the window of the chamber, jumped outside to see it continued but saw nothing left of it. Then he looked down to the last chamber sitting on the ground. Where the river flowed from, then he looked up to the highest and largest chamber buried atop the cliff. Nothing was extraordinary about the mural, but like an enchantment. He had been seduced, wanting to know only two things. Northern lowered his gaze again with the question, where were they coming from? And his eyes scaled up, and where are they going to? Gripped in the heart by curiosity, Northern jumped into the chamber, then began to hurry down the stairs that led to the cascaded down the cliff, connect each chamber to the one lower. Eventually his legs stepped on the lowest ground level. Northern looked around for a moment but couldn't see Night Terror. He didn't care much about the monster, for there was another matter to tend to. Maybe this was just a side of himself he never knew he had, investigating histories. I've always loved history back in university. Indeed, he always have. Engineering was just a path that boasted of more money, more prestige. Well, that got the better of him. The past is the past. Let's focus on this mural in front of us. Northern called himself together, slapping his cheek. Then he entered the first chamber. From the first chamber itself flowed the narrow stream of water. Northern arched a brow as he entered. There in the center was the same maiden, with a bowl on her head. The difference, however, was that this bowl was filled with water and overflowing downward. A narrow cavity had formed on Thr ground where the water endlessly flowed through. Northern looked down and trailed the stream of water off with his eyes. The pathway does not seem man-made. Even the temple. Maybe because he was an engineer in his past life, Northern was quite akin to some small details in the settlement, or to better put, cluster of temple chambers. This place lacked structural architectural design of at least for what temples that are built attached to caverns should be. If anything, they looked like they had been cut out of the cliff itself, which seemed so strange. What colossal being would have been capable enough to sculpt out a cluster of temples from a cliff and pass a message of history with those tiny murals? Northern did not know who it could have been, but he suspected that the person was undoubtedly the peak of magnificence, even for a sculptor. Chapter 79. The Journey of Murals. The first murals inscribed upon the wall depicted 7 humans. He wasn't sure if they were humans, but they all looked like one, but what was different about them was that they were holding something. The sun. Northern could tell it was the sun because a larger version of what they were carrying sat far above their heads and shone its light across to all. The next mural made Northern's jaw drop. With what looked like a stick, the much larger sun was struck by another human. There was a resemblance with this human. It wore the same tunic on its waist as it did in the same chamber before, and for some reason, its eyes was painted black. Northern was just observing that feature, but also remembered he had seen something like that in the chamber he was coming from. Northern took a second to look into the eyes of the humanoid mural. Strangely, he felt like he was being sucked in by a deep and vast emptiness. The feeling of almost losing himself. Again. Northern blinked and looked at the black hand wraps that covered his palm and backhand. Nah, that can't be the case. The hand wraps were supposed to ward off any kind of mental attack on him. Either the wrap was a fake, or what happened there was not a mental attack. Or an attack at all. Its emptiness was just captivating. I feel drawn to it. Northern spent a couple of minutes looking at it but avoided going close. Then he turned to the other murals and began to study them too. After the destruction of the large sun, the other 7 sun-bearers brought their sun together to create another sun. Afterwards, there was a confrontation between them and the Sun Destroyer, a battle that resulted in their defeat. Then a being manifested itself from the sun, alongside 7 maidens. That was where the first one had ended. Northern looked around the wall. There were other inscribed symbols and things he didn't know, but this was the only imagery depiction. It followed a straight line along the wall that held the sculpture of the lady carrying an overflowing water. Looking back one last time, Northern jumped out through the window. He had to carefully climb the cliff, then entered the next chamber through the window, and began to study its murals too. From this point, the maidens were chained and standing before the Sun Destroyer. The man that manifested from the sun was floating above the maidens. Then the next mural had the maidens putting a chain on the Sun Destroyer's wrist. From that point, they began to walk forward. Northern followed through. This time he took the stairs back up to the 3rd building. They were still walking. Then the 4th chamber, which was the building he had first entered. They were still working. Where the hell are they taking him to? Northern questioned inwardly as he left the chamber and climbed the stairs to the 5th one. Honestly, what had happened down there was a bit strange. He spoke to himself as he walked. The mural at the ground level depicted the man that came out of the sun and the Sun Destroyer were about to enter combat. Then he brought out maidens. And the Sun Destroyer was unable to react? Why? Northern sighed as he stopped in front of the 5th doorway. There's either something twisted that happened there or the murals are incomplete. He then entered and went on to inspect the next one. As expected, they are still walking. From this 5th chamber, there was only 2 chambers remaining to reach before the building that perched atop the cliff. Only 2. Northern's eyes suddenly widened. He leaned closer and counted the maidens walking with the Sun Destroyer. Upon realizing it, he let out a shout. 3! 3! How could I have missed it? He ran out in haste, almost slipping as he scuttled down the stairs and checked the chamber before. It was the same, only 4 maidens made it there. Northern looked down. I probably don't have to reach those places to know. The maidens reduced as the journey to the top of the cliff went forth. Although Northern very much guessed that this was not a literal journey to the top of the temple since it was a mural. He assumed it was telling that story. And every chamber is a checkpoint of their journey. At every checkpoint, maidens are reduced. Why? What is happening to the maidens? Northern was curious. His eyes scaled up to the highest building on the cliff. Somehow he felt like he was going to find an answer there. And because of that, he just wanted to jump the next two maidens and go straight to the temple to find out what was going to happen. But Northern was a very meticulous person when it came to details. With how enthusiastic he was about seeing what happened in the highest cave, he warded off the feel and made sure to check the last two chambers. By the time he left the last one before the main temple, only the Sun Destroyer was left. But strangely enough, he was still walking. The maids are all gone. Shouldn't you be breaking free from that chain now and wreaking havoc or maybe destroying the moon? Northern had so many questions racing through his mind. What exactly did the Sun Man do? What are these maidens? Why did they keep disappearing? Why did the fight not happen because they appeared? And so many more. Northern suspected that these maidens could have been chain bearers for the Sun Destroyer, but that postulation did not make sense to him. Reason being that they were disappearing. Northern scratched his head and looked up to the last building. His whole body was tingling with anticipation. Maybe because it had been so long since he had fun like this, he was so excited. Northern used to love the stories his mother told him, although then he was only using them to pry for information. His eyes grew somber for a moment. I miss Mom. Shin. A second later, Rue refocused and creased with determination. The only thing that stood between him and the temple was the long winding stairs that led to the top of the cliff. Northern smacked his lips and moved forward, muttering, "Crap. I think I'm hating stairs already." Chapter 80 Vestige of the Chaos Prince. After an annoying climb, Northern leaned on the doorway of the last chamber, panting. The last chamber was perched at the very point top of the cliff. It in fact looked like the first to have been sculpted out. Intricate patterns adorned the exterior stone walls unlike the others, and there was a door, unlike the others. However, Northern frowned. The door was opened. Slowly, Northern pushed the door wider and entered, saying, "So, this is where you've been." The stalwart terror turned its head to look at Northern and with a dismissive gaze, turned back to its front. Northern arched his brow and wanted to make an issue out of it but hesitated. There was something about night terror that made the air serious. Or is it because of this? Northern thought as he stood next to the terror and raised his head to behold the massive statue. Unlike the other maidens, this statue was different, filling the air with an imposing aura despite being a lifeless cut out of stone. Its eyes were hollow, empty. It looked like the sculptor had missed that part. But if Northern was going to define it, emptiness, void, he mumbled. He didn't know why, but it connected so much with him. Why? The question rang in Northern's head. Why was he feeling so drawn to this thing? What was it that was in him that was resonating to these murals? Then he turned his head to look at Night Terror. The monster was just as engulfed as he was. It spared no glance to the side and just stared into the hollow eyes of the statue. I guess he is as drawn as I am. Northern smacked his lips irritatedly. It kind of sucked to find out there was nothing special about him. This was just a magnificent memory that bewitched whoever saw it. Those eyes, they were dark, evil, empty, yet beautiful. Am I going crazy? Maybe the effect was starting to take place again. Northern looked at his hand wraps. They were so cool that an air of mystery was added to him. Maybe that was why he was so confident in their abilities to do their job. Of course, unlike most other weapon abilities that needed to be activated, this worked normally. He didn't need to actively supply its soul energy. Well, not that he could even if he needed to, which was why these hand wraps were very impressive in Northern's eyes. But if it turned out that Northern's all-so-perfect hand wraps were actually being ineffective, he shook his head rigorously. I don't know why, but I feel like this is not an attack. What if he was just being tricked again? It wasn't like he saw the madness coming through. Oh well, I guess I will just be consumed again. Northern allowed a small smile. It was utterly useless to worry about the things that were out of one's control. So was Northern's belief. He stepped backwards to envisage the entirety of the statue. Just like the rest of the maidens, the man was also kneeling. But his felt powerful. Northern took a deep breath in, seeping in the might of the statue. As he did, then he breathed out. The statue was kneeling on one leg, with both arms spread. It was like the man was carrying an overwhelming weight and it was forcing him to his knees. However, there was no weight on it, except the cliff itself. Could it be carrying the entire cliff? Northern wondered. In fact, when he looked at it, that was what it seemed. Like the Sun Destroyer was being forced to carry a weight much larger than it could bear. Northern scoffed. What weight could be so heavy for a man that destroyed the sun to carry? He mused. Perhaps the weight of the world. At first it seemed funny, but a second later it wasn't so funny anymore. The more he watched the statue, the more somber he became. Both of them stood there in grave silence, motionless and staring into the hollow eyes of the Sun Destroyer. Night Terror on the right, Northern on the left. They ard for a while. Then something glinted into their eyes from the depth of the void of the man's eyes. Night Terror's eyes widened and his claws without delay thrust into the right eye of the man. Luckily, Northern did not lag behind. He had also seen the glint, and the moment Night Terror smashed his hand into the right eye socket, his hands also followed, smashing into the left. His fist tinged a little, but that concerned him less, because there was something at the end of his fist. He slowly turned his head to Night Terror, the stalwart monster too doing the same. Then both of them withdrew their hands. Clasped within Night Terror's crude claw was a small orb. It was just like a soul core except much smaller. It was pitch black, seeming to contain a swirling sea of darkness. Northern frowned a little as he looked into the orb. Then he understood something. This is it. The thing that was drawing him in. It was the void that was in man's eyes. Void, after all, is a dangerous sea of darkness that seeks only to consume all, leaving only echoes of despair. So was he. Northern paused. He had not finished thinking, but seeing Night Terror swallow the orb of darkness was so shocking and disturbing that he had to pause whatever he was thinking about. Night Terror turned its 4 malicious gleaming eyes to him, radiating with a palpable greed. Northern frowned. No, you don't. He threw the orb into his mouth before Night Terror could do anything and swallowed down, staring at the monster with an evil smug grin. Night Terror glared at him indifferently, silence ensuing between them for a couple of seconds. Then a tremendous torrent of pain fell on both of them, pushing them to their knees. Northern let out a guttural cry. For Night Terror it was a power growl that seemed to shake the very earth. Both of them tried to scramble through the ground with their arms and legs, but something had gripped them by the heart, and was spreading its root into their soul. For Northern, he could feel it so much. A tremendous sea of darkness spreading throughout his soul, threatening to consume any and everything. Since he had no soul core, there was literally nothing to consume. The pain he had to endure was that of the vast soul energy he had received from touching the crystal during his evaluation, being overwhelmed and corrupted by the void that was spreading throughout his soul at a speedy rate. It was a burning pain. It made his body feel so weak that he slumped to the ground and lay there like a dead man, unable to move even a finger as the darkness of void overwhelmed his soul. Then he heard a voice. An anomaly is being sensed in your soul. Anomaly will be perg #%%#%###. Due to absence of soul energy, the voice of Ul has been weakened. Due to the presence of a new kind of energy, Copycat System has gained enough influence to override the voice of Ul. Copycat System has overridden the voice of Ul. Congratulations! You have received a name. You have received 3 new attributes. A genetic attribute has been found in your soul. You have gained 1 new attribute,